My name is Carol Hensley. I'm 44 years old. And I want to be honest with you from the very first sentence. I am not someone who believes in revenge. I was raised in a house where my father said two things so often they became the background noise of my entire childhood. Work hard. Stay quiet. He said it at the breakfast table in Memphis, Tennessee every single morning while my mother poured his coffee and I ate my Cheerios, and the Tennessee morning came through the kitchen window the way it always did. Warm. Unhurried. Like the day had nowhere particular to be. My mother died when I was 11 years old. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning she didn't wake up. I remember the exact date because it was 3 days before my 6th grade science fair, and I had spent 4 weeks building a working model of the water cycle, and I never finished it. That project is still in a box in my attic in Nashville. I haven't opened that box in 33 years. Some things you just leave closed. Dad grieved for 2 years. Quietly. The way he did everything. Then he met Barbara. Barbara Hensley. Formerly Barbara Klein. From Germantown, Tennessee. 51 years old when she married my father. Perfectly highlighted hair. A laugh that filled rooms. The kind of woman who remembered your name after meeting you once and made you feel like that was a special thing. She was warm. She was charming. And from the very first Sunday dinner she sat at our kitchen table. She looked at me like I was a problem she hadn't anticipated. I was 38 years old. Grown. Living in Nashville. Successful. Nobody's problem. But Barbara had a particular talent. She could make invisible things visible. And visible things invisible. And over the next 6 years. She made me invisible in my own father's life so slowly and so completely that by the time I noticed what had happened, the damage was already done. I found out the full extent of it on a Tuesday morning in March. In a lawyer's office in Memphis. Where my father's will was read out loud in front of me for the first time. The reading lasted 4 minutes. Barbara cried for 4 hours. And I finally understood everything. I need to tell you about my father first. Because nothing that Barbara did makes any sense without understanding who Robert Hensley was. Dad was 67 years old when he died. Retired electrician. 32 years with Memphis Light Gas and Water. The kind of man who fixed his own plumbing and changed his own oil and believed deeply that if something was worth doing it was worth doing yourself without making a fuss about it. He was not a demonstrative man. He didn't say I love you easily. He showed it in other ways. In the way he showed up to every school play I was ever in, even the bad ones. In the way he kept my mother's photo on his nightstand for 27 years after she died. In the way he called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. for my entire adult life without ever missing a single week. Every Sunday. 7 p.m., like clockwork. How's work, Carol? How's the house? You eating okay? 3 questions. Every week. For 22 years. It wasn't poetry. But it was him. And I knew what it meant. He met Barbara at his church in 2017. Germantown Baptist. He had been going there since before I was born. She had joined after her own divorce the year before. He called me on a Sunday in April that year. 7 p.m., the usual time. He said, Carol, I've been spending some time with a woman from church. Barbara Klein. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I said, Dad, that's wonderful. Tell me about her. He did. Carefully. The way he talked about everything. She's warm. She's good company. She lost her husband a few years back. She understands what it's like. I said, I'm happy for you, Dad. Really. I meant it. I had watched my father be alone for 27 years. Watched him keep my mother's photo on the nightstand and call me every Sunday and fill the hours between with work and church and fixing things that didn't need fixing. He deserved company. He deserved warmth. I just didn't know yet what kind of warmth Barbara was offering. They got married 14 months later. June 2018. Small ceremony at the church. 30 people. I was there in the front row in a blue dress that I had driven to 3 different stores in Nashville to find because I wanted to look right for my father's wedding. Barbara was gracious that day. She hugged me at the reception and said, Carol, your father talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you. I said, I feel the same way, Barbara. Welcome to the family. She smiled. That smile that filled rooms. I drove back to Nashville that evening feeling genuinely good about it. Feeling like maybe this was going to be fine. Better than fine. Maybe Barbara would be someone who added to our small family rather than complicated it. I was optimistic. That was my first mistake. The changes started small. the way the most significant changes always do. August 2018. I called Dad on a Sunday at 7 p.m. the way I always did. Barbara answered his phone. She said, "Oh, Carol, honey, he's just in the middle of something. Can he call you back?" He called back 2 hours later. Apologized. Said he'd lost track of time. It happened again the following Sunday. And the one after that. By October his callback times had shifted. Sometimes 8 p.m. Once it was 9:30 and he sounded tired, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes instead of our usual 15. Small things. Reasonable things. The kind of things that happen when a person's life changes and their schedule adjusts. I told myself that. I told myself that for a long time. Thanksgiving 2018 was the first time I felt it clearly. Not as a suspicion. Not as something I could talk myself out of. As a fact sitting in the room with everyone pretending not to see it. Dad and Barbara were hosting at the house on Maple Grove Drive. The same house I had grown up in. Same kitchen. Same dining room table that had been in our family since before I was born. Same view of the backyard through the window where Mom used to grow tomatoes every summer. Barbara had redecorated. Not dramatically. Not everything. But enough. New curtains in the living room. A different rug in the entryway. The kitchen repainted from the pale yellow I had known my entire life to a shade of gray that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Mom's china was not on the table. Barbara had her own china. White with a thin gold rim. Elegant. Expensive looking. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Barbara had also invited her own family. Her daughter Melissa from Collierville. Melissa's husband Todd. Their 2 kids. Her brother Gary and his wife from Bartlett. 8 people I had never met sitting at my childhood Thanksgiving table. Dad sat at the head. Barbara at the other end. I was between Melissa and Gary's wife, whose name I learned and forgot 3 times during dinner, because I was spending most of my mental energy managing the particular feeling of being a guest in the house where I grew up. Dinner was good. Barbara was a good cook. The turkey was perfectly done, and she had made cornbread dressing from scratch, which is the only kind that matters in Tennessee, and I told her so genuinely, because it was true. She said, "Oh, Carol, that means so much coming from you. Your dad told me your mother's dressing was legendary. I've been so nervous about it." It was a kind thing to say. The right thing to say. I looked at my father at the head of the table. He was smiling. That quiet, specific smile he got when he was content. When things felt right to him. I was glad he was smiling. I just wished I felt less like a visitor. After dinner, Barbara's daughter Melissa helped clear the dishes, and I went to help too, and we ended up in the kitchen together loading the dishwasher, while the men watched football in the living room. Melissa was pleasant. Friendly. The kind of woman who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. She said, "So you live in Nashville? What do you do?" I said, "I'm a financial advisor. Been with the same firm 11 years. She said, "Oh wow, that's impressive. Do you have family up there?" I said, "Not really. Just me. My mom passed when I was young, and it's always just been Dad and me." Melissa nodded. Said, "I'm sorry about your mom. Barbara mentioned she passed young." I said, "She did. It was a long time ago though." Melissa said, "Well, I hope you know you're always welcome here. Mom really wants this to feel like one big family." I smiled. Said, "That's sweet. Thank you, Melissa." I meant it. But driving back to Nashville at 9 p.m. on Thanksgiving night through the dark Tennessee interstate, I thought about Mom's china packed away somewhere. About the yellow kitchen painted gray. About 8 people I didn't know at my childhood table. And I thought about what one big family meant when one half of it had 30 years of history in that house, and the other half had been there since June. I turned the radio up. Drove home. Called Dad the following Sunday at 7 p.m. Barbara answered. 2019 was the year the small things became impossible to ignore. Not because Barbara did anything dramatic. Not because there was a single moment I could point to and say there. That was it. That was when everything changed. It was quieter than that. More deliberate. The way water shapes stone. Not by force, but by persistence. February. Dad's birthday. I drove down from Nashville with his gift. A new toolbox. The good kind. Craftsman. 450-piece set. Because his old one was 30 years old, and the latches didn't close properly anymore, and I had been meaning to get him a new one for 2 years. I got to the house on Maple Grove at noon. Barbara's car was in the driveway. And Melissa's. And a car I didn't recognize that turned out to belong to Barbara's brother Gary. They were already in the middle of lunch. Nobody had told me lunch was at noon. I had assumed I would be there for lunch because I had always been there for lunch on Dad's birthday. For 44 years his birthday lunch had been the two of us. Catfish from the place on Summer Avenue that he had been going to since 1987. Always catfish. Always the same booth by the window. This year it was Barbara's pot roast at the kitchen table with 6 people who all knew each other and 1 who didn't. Dad stood up when I came in. Hugged me. Said, "Carol, come sit down." Barbara made pot roast. I sat down. Ate pot roast. Smiled the whole time. Drove back to Nashville at 4 p.m. Cried somewhere around mile marker 47 on I-40. Not because of the pot roast. Because of the catfish place on Summer Avenue and the booth by the window and 44 years of just the two of us that had ended without anyone saying it was ending. March. I called Dad on a Tuesday. Not our usual Sunday. Just to talk. Barbara answered. Said he was resting. Said she'd have him call me back. He called back 4 days later. 4 days. I said, "Dad, is everything okay?" I called Tuesday. He said, "I know, Carol. I'm sorry. Things have just been busy." I said, "Busy how? Are you feeling all right?" He said, "I'm fine. Barbara keeps me on a schedule now. It's good for me. Doctor said so." A schedule. I said, "What kind of schedule?" He said, "Meals at regular times. Rest in the afternoons. She worries about my blood pressure. She means well, Carol." I said, "I know, Dad. I'm glad someone's looking after you." I said it the way I said most things that year. Calmly. Without showing what was underneath. May. I called to say I was coming for Memorial Day weekend the way I had every year since I moved to Nashville. Barbara answered. Said, "Oh, Carol, honey, we actually have plans that weekend. Gary and his family are coming down from Bartlett. We're doing a big cookout. You should come if you want, but it might be a little crowded. If you want. My childhood home. Memorial Day weekend. If you want." I said, "That's okay, Barbara. I'll come another time." I hung up. Sat in my Nashville apartment for a long moment. Then I called my best friend Janet. We had been friends since UNC. She had heard the previous versions of this story. The Thanksgiving china. The birthday pot roast. The Sunday phone calls. She listened to the Memorial Day story. Then she said, "Carol, I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear me." I said, "Okay." She said, "This woman is slowly making you a stranger in your father's life. And she's doing it so carefully that every individual thing sounds reasonable when you describe it. But put them all together and tell me what you see." I put them all together. New curtains. Gray kitchen. Mom's china packed away. Birthday lunch without catfish. Afternoon rest schedule. Memorial Day cookout. If you want. I said, "Janet, what do I do?" She said, "You talk to your father. Directly. Without Barbara in the room." That was easier said than done. Because getting time with my father without Barbara in the room had become the most difficult logistical challenge of my adult life. I drove to Memphis on a Wednesday in June. Unannounced. Not to be dramatic. Not to catch anyone doing anything. But because every time I called ahead, Barbara answered and managed the logistics, and by the time I arrived, everything was arranged in a way that included 6 other people, and left no room for a conversation that was just me and my father. So I didn't call ahead. I left Nashville at 6 a.m. Drove I-40 west through the Tennessee morning. Coffee in the cup holder. Radio low. The kind of drive I had made 100 times since I moved to Nashville at 22, that still felt like coming home, even when coming home had started to feel complicated. I pulled into the driveway on Maple Grove at 8:15 a.m. Dad's truck was there. Barbara's car was not. I sat in my car for a moment. Then I knocked on the front door. Dad answered in his robe. Coffee in hand. That look on his face that people get when something expected shows up unexpectedly. He said, "Carol, what are you doing here?" I said, "I came to see you, Dad. Can I come in?" He stepped back. "Let me in." The house smelled like coffee and Barbara's particular brand of fabric softener. Lavender. It was on everything now. The couch cushions. The throw blanket on the recliner. The curtains she had hung in the living room. My mother had used unscented everything because she said she wanted the house to smell like the house. Not like a product. I sat at the kitchen table. Dad poured me coffee without asking because he had been pouring me coffee since I was 16 years old, and some things are automatic. He sat across from me. He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, I don't know, Dad. That's why I'm here. He looked at me over his mug. I said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me the way you've always been honest with me. He said, okay. I said, do you feel like we've gotten further apart this past year? He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. A bird outside somewhere. He said, things change, Carol. That's just life. I said, I know things change. But Dad, I drove down here unannounced at 6 a.m. because I can't get you alone on the phone anymore. Because Barbara answers and manages when I can call back, and I missed Memorial Day for the first time in 20 years, and I wasn't at your birthday catfish lunch, because nobody told me lunch was at noon. He looked at his coffee. I said, I'm not trying to cause problems. I just miss you. And I feel like I'm losing access to you in a way that I don't fully understand. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Barbara tries hard, Carol. She wants things to be good for everyone. I said, I know she does, Dad. But does she know that Sunday at 7 p.m. has been our time for 22 years? Does she know that your birthday lunch has always been just the two of us at the catfish place on Summer Avenue? He looked up. He said, I didn't think about it that way. I said, I know you didn't. I'm not angry with you. I just need you to think about it now. He nodded slowly. That careful, deliberate nodding he did when he was processing something he didn't want to rush. He said, I'll talk to Barbara. I said, okay, Dad. Thank you. We sat at that kitchen table for another hour. Just the two of us. He told me about a neighbor's fence he had helped fix the week before. About the tomatoes he had planted in the backyard. About a woodworking project he was thinking about starting. Normal things. Small things. The things we used to talk about every Sunday at 7 p.m. I drove back to Nashville that afternoon feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Like my father was still there. Still himself. Still mine in the way that parents belong to their children in ways that nobody else can replicate. Barbara's car was pulling into the driveway as I was pulling out. We stopped side by side. Windows down. She smiled. That room-filling smile. She said, Carol, what a surprise. I wish I'd known you were coming. I said, just a quick visit, Barbara. It was good to see Dad. She said, of course. You're always welcome, honey. This is your home too. She said it warmly. Perfectly. And something in her eyes was doing something else entirely. I smiled back, said goodbye, drove home, and started paying closer attention. Dad did talk to Barbara. I know because the following Sunday at 7 p.m. my father called me himself. First time in 8 months that the call came from him directly without going through her first. He said, Carol, it's 7 o'clock. 4 words. That was it. But I understood everything inside them. I said, hey, Dad. Right on time. We talked for 22 minutes. About the tomatoes. About the woodworking project. About a documentary he had watched about the Tennessee Valley Authority that he thought I would find interesting. Normal. Ours. When we hung up, I sat on my Nashville couch and felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight for 8 months. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe Barbara was genuinely trying, and the adjustments were just the natural friction of two families becoming one. Maybe Dad had talked to her, and she had heard him, and things would find their proper shape. I wanted to believe that. For about 6 weeks I almost did. Then August came. Dad mentioned casually on a Sunday call that he and Barbara had met with an attorney. I said, an attorney? What for? He said, just estate planning. Barbara thought it was a good idea to get everything organized. She's very practical about these things. I said, Dad, did you already have a will? He said, yeah, had one since your mother passed. But Barbara said it was outdated. Things have changed. I said, what things have changed? He said, well, I'm married now. Barbara's part of my life. The attorney said it made sense to update everything to reflect that. I said, of course. That makes sense. Did you work with your old attorney? Bill Crawford? Bill Crawford had been my father's attorney for 20 years. Had helped him set up the original will after Mom died. Solid man. I had met him twice. Dad paused. He said, no. Barbara has an attorney she's used before. Seemed easier to just use someone she already knew. Barbara's attorney. I wrote that down after we hung up. In the Notes app on my phone, the way I wrote down everything that felt important that year. August 14th, Dad updated will. Used Barbara's attorney. Not Bill Crawford. I called Bill Crawford's office the following Monday. His receptionist answered. I explained who I was. Said my father had been a client for 20 years, and I had some questions about estate planning generally. Bill called me back himself that afternoon. I told him what Dad had said. The updated will. Barbara's attorney. Bill was professional. Careful. Said, Carol, I can't speak to what another attorney may have advised. But I'll tell you generally that when a recently remarried individual updates their estate documents with an attorney who has an existing relationship with the new spouse, it's worth understanding the details of what was changed. I said, how do I find that out? He said, you ask your father directly. He has every right to share that information with you. And you have every right to ask. I said, and if he doesn't share it? Bill said, then you wait, and you document what you know. I thanked him. Hung up. Called Dad that Sunday. 7 p.m. He called first the way he had been doing since June. After we talked about the tomatoes and the woodworking project, I said, Dad, can I ask you about the will? Just generally. I want to make sure I understand where things stand. A pause. Longer than usual. He said, Carol, I don't really want to get into the details of all that. I said, I understand. I just want to know that you thought it through carefully. That it reflects what you actually want. He said, Barbara helped me think it through. She's practical about these things. Barbara helped me think it through. I said, okay, Dad. I trust you. I hung up. Opened my notes app. Added one line under August 14th. Dad won't discuss details. Barbara helped him think it through. Then I called my own attorney. Her name was Susan Park. Estate law. Nashville. Recommended by a colleague 2 years earlier. I told Susan everything. The marriage. The new will. Barbara's attorney. Dad's reluctance to discuss details. Susan listened carefully. Then she said, Carol, you cannot challenge a will before someone passes. Your father has every legal right to leave his estate to whoever he chooses. What you can do right now is document everything. Dates. Conversations. Any changes in behavior or access. And if anything happens, and the will turns out to be something you believe doesn't reflect your father's true wishes, you'll have a record. I said, what would make it challengeable? She said, undue influence. If you can demonstrate that someone used their position and access to pressure or manipulate your father into making decisions that didn't reflect his own genuine wishes. That's a legal basis for challenge. Undue influence. I looked at my notes app. 8 months of small things that each sounded reasonable on their own. Put together, they were starting to sound like something else entirely. The next 2 years were the longest of my life. Not because of any single dramatic event. Because of the accumulation. The slow, steady accumulation of small things that I documented and filed and carried quietly while going to work every day and managing my clients' financial portfolios with a steadiness that had nothing to do with how steady I actually felt inside. 2020 was hard for everyone. I know that. The pandemic changed the shape of everything, including how much I could see my father. But here's what I noticed. Barbara managed that distance better than I did. Because Barbara was already there. While I was in Nashville making socially distanced visits and dropping groceries at the front door and waving at Dad through the window like a visitor. Barbara was inside. Every day. Managing the house. Managing his schedule. Managing the information he received and the conversations he had and the version of the world he was living inside. By the time things opened up again in 2021, something had shifted in my father that I couldn't quite name. He was still himself in the broad strokes. Still called on Sundays. Still asked about work and the house and whether I was eating okay. Still fixed things around the house and watched the same news programs he had watched for 30 years. But there was a distance in him that hadn't been there before. Not coldness. Just distance. Like he was slightly further away than he used to be even when we were in the same room. I mentioned Melissa once. Barbara's daughter. Said I had seen her post something on Facebook about a new house she and Todd had bought in Collierville. Dad said, yeah, beautiful place. We helped them with the down payment. I said, you helped them with the down payment? He said, Barbara wanted to. Family helps family, Carol. That's just how it is. I said, of course. That's generous of you both. I wrote it in my notes that evening. Dad helped Melissa and Todd with house down payment. Amount unknown. Date unknown. Dad turned 65. Retired officially from Memphis Light Gas and Water after 32 years. I drove down for his retirement party. Barbara had organized it at the house. 40 people. Catered. a slideshow of photos from his career. I was in 2 of the photos, out of approximately 60. Both were from before 2018. I stood in my childhood living room eating catered chicken and looking at a slideshow of my father's life that contained 6 years of my adulthood and found almost no evidence I had been present for any of it. I smiled the whole evening, drove home, called Janet from the interstate the way I always did when I needed to say out loud what I couldn't say in the room. She listened. Then she said, "Carol, how long are you going to keep doing this?" I said, "Doing what?" She said, "Being quiet. Watching. Documenting. When are you going to actually say something?" I said, "Janet, he's 65 years old. He just retired. He's happy. What exactly do you want me to say?" She said, "I want you to say what you actually think. To him. Not to me at 9 p.m. on I-40. I said, "And what happens after I say it?" He gets upset. Barbara gets involved. I become the difficult daughter. And I lose whatever access I still have. Janet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You might be right. I hate that you might be right." I said, "So I keep watching." She said, "For how long?" I said, "Until something changes." Something changed in January 2023. Dad called on a Sunday. 7 p.m., the usual time. But his voice was different. Slower. A little breathless in a way that I noticed immediately because I had been listening to his voice every Sunday for 22 years and I knew every variation of it. I said, "Dad, are you feeling okay?" He said, "I'm all right. Just a little tired lately. Barbara's making me take it easy." I said, "How long have you been tired?" He said, "Few weeks. Doctor says my heart is working a little harder than it should. Nothing serious. Just monitoring it. His heart." I said, "Dad, I'm coming down this weekend." He said, "Carol, you don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to. I'll be there Saturday morning." I drove down Saturday. Barbara met me at the door. She said, "Carol, he's resting." I said, "I know, Barbara. I just want to see him." She held the door for a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped back and let me in. Dad was in his recliner in the living room. Not in bed. Not incapacitated. Just tired in the particular way that a man's body announces that it has been working hard for 65 years and would appreciate some consideration going forward. He looked up when I walked in. That smile. Quiet and specific and entirely his. He said, "Carol, you didn't have to drive all the way down here." I sat on the couch across from him. The same couch I had sat on my entire life. Barbara's new throw blanket on the armrest. Lavender fabric softener. I said, "I wanted to, Dad. How are you feeling?" He said, "Like an old man who worked too hard for too long." Which is exactly what I am. I said, "What did the cardiologist say exactly?" He said, "Atrial fibrillation. Heart's beating irregular sometimes. They put me on a blood thinner. Said take it easy. Reduce stress." Barbara's been very good about that. I looked at my father in his recliner. 65 years old. Retired. Heart condition. Blood thinner. And Barbara managing all of it. I said, "Dad, I want to be more involved in your care. I want to know when your appointments are. I want to be able to call your cardiologist if I have questions." Dad looked at me carefully. He said, "Barbara handles all of that, Carol. She's very organized." I said, "I know she is. But I'm your daughter. I'd like to be involved." He said, "I don't want to make things complicated." I said, "It's not complicated, Dad. I just want to know what's happening with your health." Barbara appeared in the doorway then. Coffee tray. 2 mugs. Cookies on a plate. She set it on the table between us with a smile. She said, "How nice that you came down, Carol. Your dad loves seeing you." She said it perfectly. The right words. The right tone. She sat in the chair across the room and picked up her book. The conversation about Dad's medical appointments did not continue. I stayed for 4 hours. We watched a Tennessee Titans game. Ate the cookies Barbara had made. Talked about nothing complicated. When I left, Dad walked me to the door. Barbara stayed in the living room. He hugged me on the porch. Held on a little longer than usual. He said, "I'm glad you came, Carol." I said, "Me too, Dad. I love you." He said, "I love you too. Drive safe." I drove home through the Memphis evening. Dark coming down over the Mississippi River Bridge. The city lights reflecting on the water below. I called Susan Park from the interstate. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the heart condition, the cardiologist, Barbara managing all the medical information, the conversation that had stopped when Barbara walked in. Susan listened. Then she said, "Carol, I want to ask you something directly. Do you believe your father is being isolated from you intentionally?" I thought about it honestly the way Susan deserved. 6 years of small things. Phone calls managed. Visits scheduled around Barbara's family. A retirement slideshow with 2 photos. A will drawn up by Barbara's attorney that my father wouldn't discuss. And now a heart condition that Barbara was managing and that I had found out about only because Dad's voice sounded different on a Sunday phone call. I said, "Yes, Susan. I do." She said, "Then we need to talk about next steps. Not legally. Not yet. But strategically. Because if your father's health is declining, the decisions that get made in the next months and years are going to matter enormously." I said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "Document everything with dates and specifics. Request in writing to be included in his medical care. Send the request by email so there is a record. And Carol," she paused. She said, "Spend as much time with your father as he will allow. Not for the legal record. Just because he's your father and time is the one thing you cannot get back." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I know, Susan. I know." I drove home through the Tennessee dark. And I started figuring out how to get my father back before it was too late. I started driving to Memphis every other weekend. Not announcing it ahead of time anymore. Not calling Barbara to coordinate. Just showing up Saturday mornings with coffee from the Starbucks on Poplar Avenue that Dad had decided he liked after 65 years of instant coffee because Barbara had introduced him to it, and some habits are contagious regardless of their source. Dad never seemed surprised to see me. That told me something. Barbara was always there. That was simply the reality of it. She lived there. I didn't. I couldn't change that. What I could change was how often I was present in that house regardless of whether it was convenient for anyone's schedule. I took Dad to his cardiologist appointment in October. Barbara had planned to take him. She had it on her calendar. Her organized color-coded calendar that lived on the refrigerator and accounted for every hour of my father's retired life. I called Dad on a Thursday and said, "Dad, I'd like to take you to your appointment on Friday. If that's okay." He said, "Barbara was going to." I said, "I know, but I'd like to come. I want to meet Dr. Patterson. I want to hear what he says directly." A pause. Then Dad said, "Okay, Carol, that'd be fine." Barbara was in the kitchen when I arrived Friday morning. That smile. Those careful eyes. She said, "Carol, I didn't know you were coming." I said, "I wanted to take Dad to his appointment. Spend some time with him." Something moved across her face. "Gone in a second." She said, "Of course. That's sweet." Dr. Patterson was a cardiologist at Methodist Hospital on Union Avenue. 50s. Straightforward. The kind of doctor who gave you the actual information without softening it into something easier to hear. He shook my hand when I introduced myself as Robert's daughter. He said, "Good to meet you, Carol. Your father talks about you." I said, "Good things, I hope." He smiled. Said, "Always." The appointment was 40 minutes. Dr. Patterson walked us through Dad's current status. The AFib was managed but present. The blood thinner was working. He wanted to add a mild beta blocker to help regulate the heart rate. He talked about lifestyle, stress reduction, regular moderate activity. I asked questions. Real ones. The kind that showed I understood what was being said and needed the specifics. Dr. Patterson answered all of them directly. Looked at me when he spoke the way doctors look at the person in the room who is actually tracking the information. On the drive home, Dad was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You sound like a doctor in there." I said, 11 years of financial advising, Dad. You learn to ask the right questions." He said, "Your mother would have asked the same questions." I looked at the Memphis streets going past. I said, "Yeah, she would have." He said, "She was sharp. Sharpest person I ever knew." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "You're like her. More than you think." We drove in silence for a while. That particular comfortable silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill every quiet moment. When we pulled into Maple Grove Drive, Dad put his hand on my arm before getting out. He said, "Carol, I want you to know something." I looked at him. He said, "I know things have been different these past few years. I know it hasn't always felt right. And I want you to know that I see that. I'm not. I'm not always good at saying things. You know that about me. I said. I know, Dad. He said. But I see it. He got out of the car, walked up the porch steps, stopped at the door, turned back and looked at me still sitting in the driver's seat. He said, "Thank you for coming today, Carol." I said, "Always, Dad." He went inside. I sat in the driveway for a moment. I see it. 2 words that I had waited 6 years to hear in some form. They weren't enough. Not nearly enough for 6 years of Thanksgiving china and birthday catfish and Memorial Day cookouts, and a will drawn up by Barbara's attorney that he wouldn't discuss. But they were real. They were his. And they were mine. I drove back to Nashville. Called Janet from I-40 the way I always did. She said, "How is it?" I said, "He said he sees it, Janet." He actually said he sees it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Carol, hold on to that." I said, "I am." I drove through the Tennessee evening, holding on to it with both hands. Dad had a second cardiac event in February 2024. Not a heart attack. His cardiologist was careful about that distinction. A significant arrhythmia episode. His heart went into a sustained irregular rhythm for approximately 4 hours before Barbara got him to Methodist Hospital on Union Avenue. I found out from Barbara's text message. Not a call. A text. "Robert had a cardiac episode last night. He's stable. At Methodist. Room 412. That was the entire message. I was in my Nashville apartment at 7 a.m. reading that text when I should have been getting a phone call the night before. I was in my car in 11 minutes. I-40 east to Memphis. 2 hours and 14 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire drive the way you watch clocks when you're trying to control something that cannot be controlled. Dad was sitting up in bed when I walked into room 412. Pale. Tired. But himself. Eyes clear. That quiet, specific look he got when he was assessing a situation. Barbara was in the chair beside the bed. She stood when I came in. She said, "Carol, you didn't have to rush down." I looked at my father in a hospital bed and I said, "Yes, I did, Barbara." I sat on the other side of the bed. Took Dad's hand. He squeezed mine back. I said, "How are you feeling?" He said, "Like my heart forgot what it was supposed to be doing for a few hours. But I'm back on track." I said, "Why didn't anyone call me last night?" He looked at Barbara. Barbara said, "It was late, Carol. We didn't want to worry you until we knew what we were dealing with." I said, "He was in the hospital, Barbara. I needed to know." She said, "He's fine. Everything is fine." I looked at her. She looked back at me. Something passed between us in that hospital room that had nothing to do with the words we were saying. An acknowledgement of what we both actually knew. What had been true for 6 years without either of us saying it plainly. I turned back to my father. I said, "Dad, I need to be on the emergency contact list. Primary, not secondary. If something happens, I need to be called first." He said, "Carol." I said, "Dad, please. I'm your daughter. I need to know when you're in the hospital." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Barbara. She said nothing. That particular careful nothing that said everything. Dad said, "Okay, Carol. I'll talk to the hospital about the contact list." I stayed 3 days. Slept on the pull-out couch in Dad's hospital room the first night. Drove to the house on Maple Grove to shower and changed the second morning. Came back with breakfast from the diner on Summer Avenue. Biscuits and gravy. Dad's order since 1989. He ate all of it. Said, "These are better than the hospital eggs." I said, "Everything is better than hospital eggs, Dad." He almost laughed. The closest thing to a laugh his tired body could manage. Dr. Patterson came in on the second morning. Adjusted the medication. Talked about the possibility of a procedure called a cardioversion to reset the heart rhythm if the medication alone wasn't sufficient. Said Dad needed to reduce stress significantly. Said rest was not optional anymore. I asked every question I had. Dr. Patterson answered all of them. Barbara sat in her chair and listened. On the 3rd day, Dad was discharged. I drove him home. Barbara followed in her car. We got him settled in his recliner. Blanket. Water. Medications on the table beside him in the order they needed to be taken. I had written out the schedule on an index card. Taped it to the lamp where he could see it. Dad looked at the index card. He said, "Your mother used to do that." I said, "I know. She taught me." He reached up and took my hand. He said, "Carol, I want to tell you something while I'm thinking clearly. I looked at him. He said, whatever happens, whatever is in any document anywhere, you are my daughter. You have always been my daughter. And nothing that is written on any piece of paper changes what I know about that. The living room was very quiet. I said, Dad, what's in the will? He looked at the index card on the lamp. He said, I think you should talk to Susan Park. My attorney. He knew about Susan Park. I said, Dad, you know about Susan? He said, I know more than people think I do, Carol. I always have. He closed his eyes. Said, let me rest now. We'll talk more later. I sat beside him until he was asleep. Then I walked to the kitchen. Barbara was at the counter. Back to me. Making tea. Neither of us said anything. I picked up my keys and drove back to Nashville with more questions than I had arrived with. But also something else. Something my father had just handed me quietly in his living room. A warning. And a direction. I called Susan Park the morning after I got back to Nashville. She answered on the first ring the way she always did. Like she had been expecting me specifically. I told her everything. The hospital. The text message instead of a phone call. Dad's words in the living room. Whatever is in any document anywhere. You are my daughter. Talk to Susan Park. Susan was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, Carol, your father just told you the will is not what you would expect it to be. And he told you to call me. Do you understand what that means? I said, it means he knows. He knows what's in it and he knows it isn't right. Susan said, that's my read too. The question is what we can do about it while he's still here. I said, can we do anything? She said, possibly. If your father is willing to meet with an independent estate attorney. Not Barbara's attorney. Not Bill Crawford, who is retired now. Someone neutral. Someone who can sit with your father alone and establish clearly what his actual wishes are without Barbara present. I said, and if his actual wishes are different from what the current will says? Susan said, then he can change it. He has every legal right to change his will at any time as long as he is of sound mind. The question is whether he's willing to do that. And whether he can do it without Barbara finding out until it's done. I said, Susan, my father just told me to call you. From his own living room. With Barbara in the kitchen. She said, I know. That took courage, Carol. For a man like your father, that took real courage. I said, so what do we do? Susan said, I'm going to recommend an attorney. Her name is Patricia Walsh. Memphis-based. Estate law. She has handled situations like this before. Quietly. Carefully. I'll reach out to her today. I said, okay. Susan said, Carol, I need to ask you something. When your father said whatever is in any document anywhere, do you have any idea what specifically might have changed from his original will? I thought about everything I had accumulated in my notes app over 6 years. The down payment for Melissa and Todd's house. Amount unknown. Barbara's attorney. Not Bill Crawford. Dad's reluctance to discuss details. I said, I think the house is involved. And possibly the retirement accounts. But I don't know specifics. Susan said, that's consistent with what I'd expect based on everything you've described. Typically in these situations, the marital home and liquid assets are the primary targets. Targets. That word sitting in the air between us. I said, Susan, do you think Barbara planned this from the beginning? Susan was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, I think some people are very good at identifying situations that benefit them and moving toward those situations with great patience and skill. Whether that constitutes a plan from the beginning is something I can't say. What I can say is that the pattern you've described over 6 years is consistent with deliberate action rather than coincidence. Deliberate action rather than coincidence. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. 6 years of small things. New curtains. Gray kitchen. Mom's china packed away. Birthday catfish replaced with pot roast. Sunday calls managed. Memorial Day missed. A retirement slideshow with 2 photos. A will drawn up by Barbara's attorney. A text message instead of a phone call from a hospital room. And my father in his recliner saying talk to Susan Park. Patricia Walsh called me the following Thursday. She was direct. Efficient. The kind of attorney who had no interest in small talk and complete interest in the actual situation. She said, Susan briefed me on your circumstances. I want to ask you one question before we go further. Does your father want to make changes to his estate documents? I said, I believe he does, yes. She said. Has he said so explicitly? I said. Not in those exact words. But he told me to call his attorney. And he said whatever is in any document, anywhere, you are still my daughter. Patricia said. That's not explicit. But it's directional. Here's what I recommend. You ask your father directly. Not on the phone. In person. Without Barbara present. Ask him plainly whether he wants to meet with an independent attorney to review his estate documents. If he says yes, I can be in Memphis within 48 hours. I said. And if Barbara finds out? Patricia said. We moved before that matters. I drove to Memphis the following Saturday. Arrived at 8 a.m. Barbara's car was in the driveway. I knocked. Barbara answered. She said. Carol, we weren't expecting you. I said. I know, Barbara. I'd like to spend some time with Dad today if that's all right. She stepped back. Let me in. Dad was at the kitchen table with his coffee. He looked better than he had in the hospital. Color back in his face. That quiet steadiness returning. He looked up when I walked in. I said, Morning, Dad. Can we take a walk? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, Let me get my jacket. We walked the neighborhood on Maple Grove the way we had walked it my entire childhood. Same streets. Same houses. The Tennessee February cold, sharp, and clear. After half a block I said, Dad, I need to ask you something directly. He said, Okay. I said, Do you want to meet with an independent attorney? To review your will. Without Barbara. He walked 3 more steps. Then he stopped, looked at the street ahead of us, and said, Yes, Carol. I do. I texted Patricia Walsh from the driveway before going back inside. 3 words. He said yes. She replied in 4 minutes. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. I'll come to Memphis. Find a neutral location. Not the house. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. Then I texted back. Perkins Restaurant. Summer Avenue. He's been going there since 1987. Barbara has never set foot in it. Patricia replied. Perfect. See you at 10. I went back inside. Barbara was in the kitchen making lunch. That lavender smell. That careful warmth. She said, Good walk. I said, Yes. Memphis mornings are something else in February. She smiled. Said, You staying for lunch? I said, I'd love to. Thank you, Barbara. We ate lunch. The 3 of us. At the kitchen table that had been in our family since before I was born. Chicken salad sandwiches on white bread. Sweet tea. The Tennessee Sunday afternoon coming through the window. Normal. Civilized. Careful. After lunch, Dad rested. Barbara went to her sister's house for what she called her Sunday afternoon visit. A standing appointment she had kept since before she married Dad. 2 hours. Every Sunday. Reliable as clockwork. I had been counting on that. The moment her car left the driveway, I sat on the edge of Dad's bed. He was not asleep. His eyes opened when I sat down. I said, Dad, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., Perkins on Summer Avenue. Patricia Walsh is going to be there. She's an estate attorney. Independent. Nobody Barbara knows. He looked at me. I said, I'll pick you up at 9:30. We'll tell Barbara we're getting breakfast. Which is true. We will get breakfast. Dad was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Carol, what do you think is in that will? I said, I don't know exactly. But I think it's not what you would have written 10 years ago. He said, You're right. It's not. The room was very still. I said, Dad, what happened? He looked at the ceiling. He said, It happened slowly. The way things do. Barbara would mention something. Just mentioning. Not asking. Just putting it in the air. Over and over until it felt like my own idea. I said, What kinds of things? He said, That you had your own life. Your career. Your Nashville friends. That you were settled and secure and didn't need anything from me. That Melissa and Todd were just starting out. That family helps family. Family helps family. The same words he had used about the down payment. He said, She never said take care of my daughter instead of yours. She never said that. She just said take care of my daughter. Again and again until somehow I forgot that taking care of one didn't have to mean not taking care of the other. I looked at my father. 65 years old. Retired electrician. 32 years with Memphis Light, Gas and Water. The man who showed up to every school play and kept Mom's photo on the nightstand and called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. for 22 years. He said, I got confused, Carol. I got old and I got sick and I got confused. And Barbara was right there every day, and you were in Nashville, and it was just easier to let her manage things. And I knew it wasn't right. I've known it wasn't right for a long time. I said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" He said, "Because I love her." And because saying it out loud meant admitting I had let it happen. The February afternoon was quiet outside the window. I said, "Dad, tomorrow we fix it." He looked at me. He said, "You think it's that simple?" I said, "Patricia Walsh thinks it is. And Susan Park thinks it is. And I think it is." He nodded slowly. That careful, deliberate nodding. He said, "Okay, Carol. Tomorrow." I squeezed his hand. He said, "Your mother would have handled this better than me." I said, "She would have handled it differently." "Not better." He almost smiled. Said, "Get some rest tonight. You've been driving back and forth to Memphis every other weekend for a year. You must be tired." I said, "I'm fine, Dad." He said, "I know you are. You always are." He closed his eyes. I sat beside him until his breathing slowed and steadied. Then I went to the living room. Sat on the couch with Barbara's lavender throw blanket that I moved to the other end without touching it. And I waited for tomorrow. Perkins Restaurant on Summer Avenue. 9:58 a.m. Tuesday morning in February. Dad ordered his usual without looking at the menu. 2 eggs over easy. Wheat toast. Black coffee. The same order he had placed at this table since 1987. Patricia Walsh was already there when we arrived. 50s. Sharp eyes. A leather portfolio on the table in front of her. The kind of attorney who made you feel like everything was already under control before she said a single word. She shook Dad's hand. Said, "Mr. Hensley, thank you for meeting with me." Dad said, "Thank you for coming down." We ordered. Patricia waited until the coffee arrived before opening her portfolio. She spent 40 minutes with my father. I sat at the far end of the booth. Close enough to be present. Far enough to give them room. Patricia had been clear about that. She needed to establish that the conversation was his. Uninfluenced. Documented. She asked him questions. Careful ones. About his original intentions. About what he understood the current will to contain. About whether those contents reflected his actual wishes. Dad answered everything. Clearly. Steadily. In that quiet, specific way he had always spoken when something mattered. At one point he said, "I want my daughter taken care of." That has always been true. I lost track of how to make that happen. I'm finding it again now. Patricia wrote everything down. After 40 minutes, she closed her portfolio. She said, "Mr. Hensley, I can have revised documents prepared within 72 hours. We can execute them at my Memphis office on Friday morning. At that point, your estate will reflect what you've told me today." Dad looked at her. Then he looked at me. He said, "Friday morning." Patricia said, "Friday morning." He nodded once. Said, "Let's do it Friday." We executed the new documents on a Friday morning in February. Dad's house on Maple Grove Drive. Split equally between me and Barbara, as Tennessee law provides for a surviving spouse. His retirement accounts and savings. Split equally between me and Barbara. His personal property. Specific items designated clearly. Mom's china. To me. Mom's china. To me. That one line in that document meant more than any dollar amount on any page. Barbara found out that afternoon. I was not there for that conversation. I don't know exactly what was said. Dad called me that evening at 7 p.m. Our usual time. He said, "It's done, Carol." She's upset. "But it's done." I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm okay. I feel like myself again. First time in a while." I said, "I'm glad, Dad." He said, "Me too." Dad passed 8 months later. October. His heart. Peaceful. At home on Maple Grove Drive the way he had always said he wanted. I was there. Holding his hand. The will was read the following Tuesday. It lasted 4 minutes. Barbara cried for 4 hours. Not because she was left with nothing. She wasn't. Tennessee law and my father's genuine care for her meant she was provided for. She cried because what she had spent 6 years carefully building had been quietly undone on a Tuesday morning at Perkins Restaurant over eggs and black coffee. And Mom's china came home to Nashville with me. It's in my kitchen cabinet now. The good one above the counter where the morning light hits it first. Every Sunday morning I make coffee and I see it there. And I think about my father saying I lost track of how to make it happen. I'm finding it again now. He found it. So did I. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are right now. And if you're watching on Honor Unveiled, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.